Chapter 27. Bridge, ISS Warrior. High Orbit, Britannia. As soon as the Warrior Q jumped into the Britannia system, a message from Admiral Zingano appeared on Granger's terminal. "Meet me on the Victory, as soon as you get in. Bring Proctor."
Yes, you have the bridge. Commence resupply and general repair ops.
Aye, aye, Captain. He left the bridge and headed for Proctor's lab. It was on the way to the shuttle bay anyway. May as well tell her in person. Plus, it would let him get a peek at that singularity equipment she'd hauled over from the Constitution. They'd only left the devastated York system 2 hours before, but she was spending every waking moment he didn't need her on the bridge stowed away in her lab. He suspected she slept there. With his permission, she had reassigned a 15-person science team from Fleet Headquarters. Ostensibly, this was merely a satellite lab of IDF Science Division, a mobile lab that could be on the front line, the first to take data or draw samples or make observations. But in truth, Proctor was the main show. At least, that was what Granger suspected. He'd met the eggheads at IDF Science, all hat, no cattle, he believed the saying was. Most of the best scientific minds these days went to either medical or materials and weapons science. "Tim, good, you're here. Come look at this." He sat down next to her at one of the molecular imaging scopes. She gestured to the eyepiece and he looked inside.
What am I looking at?
Not entirely sure, but I think I've isolated 3 separate strains of swarm virus.
Swarm matter comes in 3 flavors, huh?
She selected the next sample and moved it into the scope's field of view.
Not quite. If you'll remember, a few months ago, I discovered that swarm matter itself was just a precursor to virus, not a virus itself. It can manufacture billions of different types of proteins, enzymes, and structures with so many functional groups that I don't even begin to know what to call them. But then I hit the swarm matter with a focused metaspace field and voila! Virus. Highly transmissible, but not through the air, thank God. Mainly mucous membranes, saliva, blood, etc.
So you're saying you want my dating history?
He deadpanned the joke as he watched the sample change yet again through the eyepiece when she dialed in the next one.
Actually, the more research I do, the more I'm convinced you're completely safe. Recent evidence to the contrary be damned. Really, Tim, do you have to go around flaunting your newfound mutant telepathic skills? I'm sure it unnerved the hell out of the bridge crew.
He nodded, still peering at the sample.
You're right, I'll be more discreet.
And speaking of the crew...
She paused, and out of the corner of his eye he saw her bite her lip, hesitating.
We've been going non-stop for 4 months, Tim. From the original Constitution crew, only about 2/3 have survived. Lots of people are on their last leg.
We're at war, Shelby,
he said, still gazing at the virus.
I know, Tim. But it wouldn't hurt to pay attention to their mental state on occasion. Raina is on edge. She babies those engines like... well, her baby, and she hasn't gotten more than 4 hours of sleep a night since lunar base.
She'll be fine. She's made of tougher stuff than you or I.
I agree, said Proctor. But even more troubling is Commander Pierce. He might hide it well, but he's been at breaking point for weeks. And now he's lost his family.
We all lost families, Shelby.
Not like him, Tim. Neither of us are married with kids.
Other people have lost spouses and kids. They're still fighting.
Barely, Tim. Barely. They're barely fighting. You don't see them the rest of the time. I do. I'm the XO. When I'm not in here with the science team or up on the bridge, I'm down in the galley or on the wreck deck.
She sighed.
Look, all I'm saying is, maybe take some time to have a few heart-to-hearts with Pierce and Raina and Prince and Diamond and Diaz. Maybe some appearances down on the wreck deck. Let the crew know that you care.
Caring's not my job, Shelby. Keeping us all alive is my job.
Caring will help them stay alive, Tim. That makes it your job.
Damn it. She was right. Again.
Fine, I'll see what I can do. Now, tell me what I'm looking at.
You'll do fine, Tim. Just like you have with everything else. We wouldn't be here if it weren't for you.
She rested a hand on his arm. What was she doing? But rather than pull the arm away, he kept it there. Not that he had anything even approaching romantic inclinations. He simply didn't have the luxuries of time nor circumstances for that. It was just nice to have a friend. He'd missed Abraham Hawes so damn much after he died during the Battle of Earth. It was good to know he wasn't alone. She cleared her throat and continued on.
But what we've got here are 3 strings. The first matches the ones I pulled from Hanrahan and Wyatt. Fishtail, too. All of them were, and in Fishtail's case is, completely under swarm control. The second is a similar virus, but it has far fewer functional groups than the first. The first had something like 2,000 bonding possibilities. The second one has just 8.
Sounds promising. 8 beats 2,000.
He looked up.
Anyone we know have this?
She nodded.
I took the liberty of getting access to a sample of Admiral Asbill's blood. Remember him?
The one who almost lost us the Battle of New Dublin? How could I forget? How did you convince him?
She shrugged suspiciously.
I had one of my new techs accidentally bump into him before she left Earth. Forged orders from Zingano. I'm sure he won't mind. Bill hates Asbill anyway.
Granger looked back into the scope.
You're telling me that John Asbill is infected with swarm virus?
I'm calling it the backdoor virus. It seems to lie inert, dormant in a person's body, unless activated by a very particular metaspace signal. The main virus responds to all kinds of signals. The backdoor virus, only to a handful.
Just like the functional groups, right?
He said, connecting the dots.
Exactly. The backdoor virus can only perform a few functions, responding to only a few metaspace signals. I assume once we examine Admiral Littlefield's blood, it'll become pretty clear why the Wellington shipyard's blue.
You think the swarm had backdoor entry into his mind? Influenced him just enough to destroy the ships?
I wouldn't be surprised. And the third,
she said, bringing up the final sample on the scope. He peered inside.
Anyone I know?
Yes. You.
He pulled back to glance at her, frowning.
Mine's detectable?
Of course. Once I knew what to look for.
And what are you looking for?
This sample matches the one I sent through the microsingularity I made. The singularity inactivated the main virus, the first virus. But something about the shock of traversing a singularity pair disrupts most of the virus's response functionality. It only responds to one waveform of metaspace signal now. But this means that you were, at one point, infected with the full virus. It tells us that Lieutenant Valls is probably right. You were on the other side of his singularity, and you were acting for the swarm.
He peered at it, with its hundreds of protrusions and cilia-like extensions and arms. One part of it was labeled with its molecular makeup. Words like ketone and methyl dominated the word soup, but several stood out to him.
Lanthanum trioxide? Iridium? Thorium? Uranium-238?
He pulled back to glance nervously at her.
I've got uranium pumping through my blood, Shelby?
Oh, calm down. It's the non-radioactive isotope, and it's less than a femtogram. You're fine. Better than stage 10,000 cancer, wouldn't you say?
He shrugged.
So, we have proof. Actual physical data that I'm not a crazy time bomb waiting to go off?
He stood up and stretched his neck after having hunched over to peer through the scope.
Maybe that will calm Norton down and half the top brass. I swear they've been calling for my head from day one. God help us all if Zingano ever kicks it.
Proctor shut the scope down and stowed her samples in her desk.
Proof? That's a stretch. It's compelling evidence, but still not proof. I doubt this will sway General Norton. Honestly, if it weren't for Avery, Norton would have had you tossed out an airlock by now.
Granger motioned to the door.
Come on, Zingano wants to see us. Let's keep him happy. I prefer to be on this side of the airlock.
They walked to the shuttle bay where a pilot stood outside his craft waiting for them. Once inside, with their restraints attached, the shuttle glided out the bay doors, revealing the deep blue atmosphere below, and beyond that, green continents. Britannia was the most Earth-like planet humanity had settled so far, more Earth-like even than Earth, and one of the first habitable planets discovered. As such, its population was burgeoning, rapidly dwarfing the cradle of humanity. Since it was slightly less dense but more massive, The land area was nearly twice as large as Earth's, and hundreds of cities peppered the coastlines along every continent.
"Shelby,"
said Granger after he'd sealed the hatch to the cockpit so they'd have another moment alone.
"We need to be able to block the swarm's metaspace signal. They do it. Since the first contact 4 months ago, they've been doing it to us. They come in, and any ship within a certain range of a carrier loses metaspace comm until the carrier is neutralized. I want that. We need that."
She closed her eyes, as if running through the possibilities, modeling who knows what in that brain of hers, immediately trying to attack the problem. That was Proctor. She never blinked in the face of an insurmountable problem. She just figured things out, and then implemented solutions, managing people and resources so expertly that his superiors had wanted to snatch her away from him. Hell, her ship, the ISS Chesapeake, was nearly ready. It had taken longer than planned to retrofit it, but it'd be ready within weeks. Yet there were already rumblings at IDF to make her an admiral, skipping the captaincy altogether. Half the push was to spite Granger, sure, but half came from the sheer admiration for her abilities. If she wasn't careful, she'd end up as head of IDF someday, and would have his condolences.
"And one more thing. We need to be able to shut down an active swarm virus."
She opened her eyes.
We've been trying, desperately. But we can't seem to move beyond the cure I injected into Wyatt. As it stands, the cure kills.
"What about something temporary? Don't cure, but block. If the cure kills, then forget it. Just focus on blocking. Or target just a few of those functional groups on the virus, and maybe give the victim a fighting chance. Let them fight swarm control."
Interesting.
She turned to stare out the window as they approached the Victory, a carbon copy replica of the Warrior and Constitution.
I hadn't thought to do a half measure like that.
She glanced over at him.
No offense.
None taken. You never were one for half measures.
I'll work on it. Both ideas.
Zingano met them in the shuttle bay and immediately handed Proctor a small briefcase.
What's this?
Blood. She and Granger eyed each other.
"Whose?"
he said. Zingano thumbed toward his chest. "For one, mine, as well as every other admiral and captain based here at Britannia. Turns out Rear Admiral Littlefield committed suicide. Bullet straight through his own brain, after he self-destructed every antimatter bomb present at Wellington Station."
"You suspect the chain of command has been infiltrated?"
said Granger. "Well, it obviously has. Look at you."
"And Admiral Asbill,"
added Proctor. Zingano smirked. "Bastard. I'll send word to IDF CENTCOM at once. Have him detained." Granger shook his head.
"The swarm doesn't know we can detect their influence. Maybe for now it would be best to allow them to think they've got us fooled."
Zingano weighed the options. "For now. But this means our circle of trust is closing. We need to test me, General Norton, Admiral Chandrasekhar, my deputy."
"And Avery?"
said Proctor. Zingano shook his head. "If Avery's got it, well, God help us all." Proctor nodded in farewell and hefted the briefcase. The shuttle door closed behind her and the craft took off, leaving Granger and Zingano alone. "You know," Zingano said, thumbing in the direction of the departing shuttle, "she's been due at the Chesapeake for a few weeks now."
"I know. I just don't think it's wise to lose her right now."
"Lose her? Huh. Putting one of the best commanders in the fleet at the helm of one of the best ships isn't what I'd call losing her."
"Damn it, you know what I mean, Bill. Plus, something tells me we need her doing the science more than we need her doing the commanding."
"IDF science is making steady progress. She's not the only one doing swarm research, Tim."
"Yeah, but she's the only one who knows what she's doing."
Zingano shrugged. "I wouldn't be surprised if Avery has a secret army of scientists somewhere working on the problem. Wouldn't put it past her. She's got more pots boiling than anyone has a right to." He fished in his pocket for something, producing a small data pad. "Speaking of which, she's got something for us." Granger examined the pad.
"Antimatter torpedoes?"
"The Warrior is to be outfitted with an entire bay of them, with launch capabilities tied in directly to the bridge. Seems she wants to avoid the fiasco that some mid-level tech caused with the antimatter bombs during the Battle of Volari 3. No more remote control, all direct."
"But why?"
asked Granger.
We tested a few of the prototypes in battle. They're just far too slow to do any good. The swarm zaps them before they make it 100 meters from the launch tubes.
He shrugged. If you ask me, I think this has more to do with the Russians than the swarm. We're not openly at war, officially, but I suspect we'll be ordered to carry out some bombing runs on the side. Make a few of their worlds pay for the betrayal. Antimatter torpedoes would do just the trick.
Granger shook his head. Good God, it's like we're as bad as the swarm now. Bombing our own worlds just because their leaders are on the wrong side?
War is messy, Tim. I thought you would have learned that by now.
I guess my humanity doesn't wash off very easily, quipped Granger.
Zingano grunted. I tend to agree with you, Tim. But either way, a team will install the equipment on your bridge while you're here at Britannia. Tomorrow morning, Avery's called a top-level meeting to discuss something she's calling Operation Ground War.
Granger raised an eyebrow. Ground War? We don't have any swarm worlds to target. Russian?
Zingano shrugged. No idea. I guess we'll find out tomorrow. All I'm told is it will be big.
Big?
A game changer. Chapter 28. Bridge, UESS Albright. High Orbit, Penumbra 3.
We've arrived in the Penumbra system, Mr. Vice President. Now approaching high orbit over Penumbra 3.
Said the navigator aboard the United Earth State Department frigate Albright. The Russians would never have allowed an IDF military vessel to approach the planet, but Volodin assured him that if he arrived in a diplomatic ship, he'd be permitted to dock at the main station. What are the scanners picking up? Said Isaacson, sitting in the captain's chair. The captain of the ship, an old freighter pilot who'd been drafted to serve in the State Department during the war, stood nearby, visibly glowering at the intrusion, but he didn't care what she thought.
The planet is mostly water, filled with high concentrations of long-chain proteins and amino acids, plus lots of other exotic organic material I don't recognize, said the officer manning the sensor station. The star it orbits is actually a binary, a main sequence orbiting a 30 stellar mass black hole, but the hole itself is pretty quiet, no danger of it consuming the star for another billion years or so.
Interesting, said Isaacson. Are we in any danger? The captain chuckled, as if she was used to suffering through space newbie questions.
They're actually quite common, relatively speaking. Galaxy has millions of black holes. Most of those are in binary or trinary star systems.
Millions?
Black holes aren't some dangerous juggernauts that roam the galaxy eating up stars and planets and shit, Mr. Vice President. It's just a star, basically, but without light. Just like you'd never dream of flying straight at the actual star right next to it, you wouldn't do the same with a black hole. And you can orbit it safely, just like Penumbra 3's doing. It doesn't just magically reach out and suck you in. We're perfectly safe, Mr. Isaacson.
I knew that, Isaacson huffed. It was a lie, of course. He didn't know the first thing about galactic composition, much less black hole dynamics, but he hated it when people assumed he was an idiot.
Of course, sir,
she said, rolling her eyes. She turned back to the sensor station.
Any sign of the station, Woojin? Coming up on it now, ma'am. Looks like it used to be a major asteroid, but it's been caved out.
Isaacson nodded. He remembered Volodin telling him that back when the Russians thought it was they who had the swarm under their control, and not the other way around, they'd had the swarm cave out a large asteroid for them as a proof of principle that they could direct the swarm to do simple tasks. Looks like they'd gone beyond simple tasks. The space station was massive. On the view screen, he saw dozens of Russian warships docked at the large rock, which here and there was dotted with patches of metal peeking out from the crater-marked surface, hinting at the vast, cavernous structure beneath the surface.
Also reading thousands of, gravitational anomalies, I guess you could say,
said Wu Jin, the young man at sensors.
Where?
Surrounding the station. Orbiting the planet.
Inside the station?
Really, they're scattered everywhere. There's what looks like a small moon beyond the station, in the middle of a debris field. The anomalies seem to be concentrated in that area. The captain stood up and walked over to examine the monitor at the sensor station.
Thousands of them. Huh. Steer clear, just in case. She turned back to Isaacson. Now, you said you were expected? I don't like the thought of hanging around here with all those warships. The UESS Albright has no defensive capabilities, you know. Don't worry, Captain Hall, we're perfectly safe, he said, mimicking her earlier assurance, in the same tone, but with an added edge of condescension. Ambassador Volodin assured me safe passage here for secret peace talks. You really think you can convince the Russians to end hostilities and join us against the swarm? Isaacson rolled his eyes. That, Captain Hall, is none of your business. He stood up and walked toward the comm station. Open up a secure channel. Diplomatic code 15. Inform Ambassador Volodin that we've arrived. A few moments later, the young man at comm nodded. Receiving confirmation. The ambassador sends his greetings, says the Russian premier is here waiting for you. Malikov himself is here? Said the captain with a sharp gasp of surprise. I told you, Captain Hall, it's none of your business. He noticed the fear in her eyes. You can't talk peace with an empire without talking to the head, he said reassuringly. Not out of concern for her emotions, of course, but to make sure she carried on with the mission to deliver him to Penumbra Station. The comm officer continued. The Premier is waiting. We're being given docking coordinates. Change course, Jill, the captain said to the navigator. Intercept course with the station. Line us up with the docking coordinates. Ma'am, began Wujin. There's a large debris field in between us and the station. We'll need to adjust our orbit by about 100 kilometers to rise up again before we attempt docking. Captain Hall nodded. Very well, make the adjustments. The navigator entered the instructions into the nav computer, as Isaacson watched the planet grow larger on the view screen as they descended into a slightly deeper orbit. Oh my God, muttered Jill. Emergency course change. Hold on. Everyone was thrown to starboard as the ship lurched to port with an acceleration that momentarily overcame the ship's inertial cancelers. What the hell happened? Demanded the captain. Another debris field. It just came in out of nowhere. I'm sure we scanned that orbit before we descended. The captain turned to the sensor officer. Wu Jin? He shook his head. I scanned it, ma'am. It must have been moving fast enough that we didn't pick it up. Or maybe it was aligned between us and that first debris field, such that our sensors couldn't distinguish the two. We're clear, Captain, said the navigator. Resuming course. The captain nodded. Keep a full sensor sweep going. I don't want to run into anything else unexpected. Chapter 29. Vols knew he was dreaming again, but it was getting harder to distinguish dreams from waking life, because he knew this wasn't just a dream. He'd been here. He'd done this. He was flying, racing other ships, hearing voices, impossible voices, and knew he had a terrible choice to make. Both of them were friends. Both deserved life. But fresh on his mind was Dogtown's fate. The swarm had taken him, and Hanrahan, and the dock, made them do horrible, unspeakable things. The swarm was coming. The ships were all around him now. He wouldn't let them get his friends, not this time. He made his choice. The dream raced ahead, jumping to the point where he was floating in space, just him in his pressurized flight suit, dangling at the end of his tow line. He reached, stretched. He knew there was a good chance he'd miss, and they'd both be lost forever. But he grabbed on, keying in the emergency open code into the pad and yanked the hatch open. She was dying. Bleeding and delirious and dying, but there was still time to save her. Chapter 30. Sick Bay, ISS Warrior. High Orbit, Britannia. He awoke with a start. The dreams were becoming clearer, but it was still difficult to remember the specifics. When he came out of that singularity, holding Fishtail in his lap, trying to make the landing on the Warrior's fighter deck without passing out, he felt sure he knew what had happened. Just like in the first waking moments after a dream, you know exactly what you dreamed about, all the details firmly in place. Somehow you dream about a great idea,
a new squadron maneuver, or a witty insult. But as soon as you reach for something to write it down, the idea fades, lost to haze and uncertainty. When he'd landed, he was certain of so many things. He'd seen the Constitution, and a large swarm carrier, far larger than any he'd ever seen. And he'd heard Granger's voice, and another voice, an impossible voice. That's where it started getting hazy. Why was it impossible? And was he even sure now that he'd heard Granger's voice? And he rescued Fishtail, that much he was sure of, but how had he done it? It was getting harder to separate dream from reality, even as he was remembering more while in the dreams. But somehow he knew he'd been confronted with a terrible choice. And there she was, the result of that terrible choice, laying in that sickbed bay. He rested his head against the window, standing vigil in his customary spot in the hallway outside sickbay, watching her breathe. Watching it breathe. Was she in there? He walked into sickbay and stood next to the transparent enclosure that kept them all safe from swarm infection. The monitor next to her bed indicated her heartbeat, her breathing pattern, all the rest of her vital signs, many of which had edged beyond normal human ranges now that the swarm virus roamed her system, changing her, for all intents and purposes making her stronger, healthier, better, but simultaneously stealing her away. The machine also monitored the level of tranquilizer in her system, and he saw that it was getting low. He waited for the beeping that would commence once the sedative wore off completely. Glancing up, he saw that the nurses on duty were busy with other patients, but for the most part, sickbay was empty. His finger was poised and ready. The monitor beeped. With a quick tap of his finger, a trigger impulse learned from dozens of life or death battles with the swarm, he switched off the sound. He looked up again. The nurses hadn't noticed the abortive beep. Fishtail started to stir. Soon her eyes fluttered and she looked at him. The smirk returned. The cold, dead, glassy eyes. Shit. They really had her.
Ballsy. How nice of you to watch over me.
Her tone was mocking.
I've seen you watching me, almost every day.
Her voice lowered and registered to a dark, mock-sultry tone.
Are you in love with me?
He ignored her taunt. We're going to destroy you, you know. You may as well give up now. She rolled her eyes.
Please. You're weak, disjointed, scattered. One leader undermining the other, one nation scheming against the next. You lack focus, you have no purpose. For humans, it is every man for himself at the expense of everyone else.
You're wrong. We help each other. We lift each other up. If you knew Fishtail at all, you'd know that. Her cold eyes drilled into him.
Help each other. Lift each other. You don't fool me, fly boy. You help your own tribe, that's it. Humanity is tribal, always has been, and left to its own primitive devices, it always will be. That's where we come in. We will elevate you. You can join the family, become our friends, and take your rightful place in the Concordat.
He leaned over the top of the enclosure. We don't want a place in your Concordat. And you're wrong. We're not just tribal. We've come far from those days. We're ballsy. She interrupted with a scoff.
Humanity hasn't changed in 100,000 years. You're just a handful of spear-shaking, jingoistic tribes that fight for that coveted spot on top of your tiny, insignificant hill. Believe me, we know. We've been watching. The Russians are trying to destroy you. You're trying to destroy the Russians. The Caliphate wants both governments destroyed, but they don't dare say it since your last war with them nearly destroyed them. And even in your own government, the factions squabble and fight. Scheming to kill each other, obtain power over the other, each fighting for his own little group of like-minded and small-minded sycophants. The shrillest, most profane leaders win, and the reasonable, quiet voices are squashed. We are not like that, Ballsy. You'll see. It'll be better with us. In the Concordat, you'll know harmony, unity, peace, and prosperity.
It was hard to argue with her, mainly because she was right. He hated the political class. Even more, he hated the oligarchic plutocrat class that pretended to be above the political fray, pretending to be outsiders when in fact they were the most deeply inculcated of all of them, protecting their money and their status. But the swarm's solution was unthinkable. Forced freedom was no freedom. Look, Fishtail, let's change the subject.
Yes, let's,
she replied with another smirk. You remember that hair-raising maneuver you pulled? Against that swarm turret? Spiraling in against who knows how many Gs, knocking it out and then flying through the fireball?
What of it?
He tried to smile, genuinely. Maybe he could reach her, connect with her, if he could just punch through the swarm cloud. Maybe reach her with real emotion. Child's play. You should see the shit I'm doing now. Unbelievable shit. They even changed my name from Ballsy to Oh My Godsy. He threw in a wink for good measure. Something, anything to reach her. But her face remained stony. Look, Fishtail, I did what you wanted. I took the ring to your parents. I played with Zack, gave him a toy, hugged him. I just wanted you to know that he's okay, and that he misses you. Terribly. Her eyes changed. They widened. A brief choking noise came from her throat, as if she was struggling to say something but couldn't bring herself to say it. And at the corner of her eye, he could swear he saw water building up. Not enough to form a tear. But he'd reached her. He was sure of it. In a moment it was gone. The haughty face returned.
Ballsy, Ballsy, Ballsy. You've been a dear. A huge help, in fact. Where is the warrior right now? On time for its appointment? I hope you don't run into any surprises while you're there.
Shit. He'd made a huge mistake, he realized now. Once awake, the swarm could not only speak through her, but apparently they could track her. At least that was the impression she was giving. He jabbed the monitor with his finger and the beeping rang out, indicating the low sedative levels in her blood. The closest nurse looked up, swore and rushed over, punching buttons and controllers to get the next dose of tranquilizer queued up.
See you soon, Ballsy,
she said as her eyes fluttered shut. Chapter 31. Presidential Command Center, Frigate 1. High Orbit, Britannia.
The plan is called Operation Ground War. After tomorrow, the swarm will have learned that you don't mess with the Marines, said President Avery. This has gone on too long, gentlemen. It is time we take the initiative. We tried it 2 months ago. Granger did a commendable job with that attempt, but even then we were reacting. We thought we were taking the initiative, taking the fight to the enemy, but for all our efforts, they expected us. It is time we do something completely unexpected. Something so ballsy and dramatic that it will change the course of the war and deliver us a steaming pile of dead swarm shit that we can flush away and get on with our lives.
She waved a hand toward General Norton and leaned back in her seat. He stood up and approached the front of the conference room, and on the table in front of him, a three-dimensional holographic display of the Skiora's super dreadnought bloomed from a single point in the air. Our target. Tomorrow, Captain Granger has a rendezvous scheduled with the Skiora vessel. He turned to address Granger. You'll keep your appointment. You'll play along, and squeeze as much intel out of them as you can. Stall for as much time as possible. Your tactical crew will begin intensive scanning of their vessel. The Skiora will expect this, of course, as we expect they will do to you. When you have a lock on their position and drift vector, you will relay their precise coordinates and velocity to my fleet, 0.1 light-years away. He turned to a trim, gray-haired man behind him. Colonel Barnard. Barnard stepped in to replace Norton and waved the holographic display forward. It zoomed in on a section of the vast ship, and a tiny holographic image of a troop transport shimmered into place. A chart of data, troop numbers, and transport capabilities appeared next to it.
Standing by in the boarding fleet will be roughly 5,000 troop transports, each carrying 195 Marines. 500,000 soldiers total, including logistics, engineers, and support crew. Analyses of the scans taken by the ISS Warrior during the last encounter have revealed that the Skjora ship contains at most 200,000 individual life readings, and it's most likely that a large portion of them are not soldiers, but crew members necessary to keep a ship that large functioning. If all goes well with the docking, we should outnumber them over 2 to 1.
That's a big if,
said Granger, and the plan was already sending off alarm bells in his mind. Attack, when they didn't even know the Skjora's true intentions?
Your scans revealed that our docking ports are compatible with theirs, with minor adjustments.
At a raised eyebrow from Granger, Colonel Barnard elaborated.
We will magnetically lock as best we can, then blow through their hatches with projectile-based explosive charges. When the door is breached, we'll throw out a cylindrical umbilical made out of a special flexible composite material that will be shepherded by a cluster of miniature bots. The umbilical would expand, and the bots will automatically find the small crevices and notches where air continues to escape and seal them, with double fail-safes.
Get to the good part, Colonel, said Avery. The part where we steal a big-ass ship and point it down the throat of every swarm fleet we detect.
Ah, yes, ma'am. Took the words right out of my mouth. As the Marines progress deck by deck, we'll rapidly take over their command and control structure, occupy key sections of the ship, and neutralize any effective opposition.
The holographic display of the dreadnought expanded again, and thousands of bright red points erupted all along the edge of its hull, spreading inward like an infection.
We anticipate that, with moderate losses, we can be in control of the entire ship within 8 hours.
Sounds like fun, said Admiral Zingano. What's the catch? General Norton stepped forward again.
No catch. Using standard ship-based combat models, we calculate the risk of failure at 12%, which the President has deemed to be an acceptable level.
Bullshit,
said Granger. Everyone turned to him. Avery's eyebrows rose high up on her forehead.
My apologies, Madam President. My comment was not directed at you, rather to the modelers.
General Norton took a threatening step toward him, and looked like he was about to call for the Marines at the door to escort him to the brig, but Avery waved him off.
Explain, Captain.
First of all, we've never met a Skjora in person. We don't know their capabilities, their strength, their speed, their ability to fight. Everything about them is unknown, except for the fact that they're bipedal and can probably carry a gun.
Norton raised a hand.
Our modelers have taken every uncertainty into account. Even with all that not completely understood, due to our numbers and adaptability, we calculate that one standard deviation of risk still gives us a 75...
And furthermore, interrupted Granger, you're forgetting one thing. We still have no idea if the Skjora are truly liberated from the swarm or not. If not, we've got a problem on our hands, don't we? 200,000 highly trained warriors, all communicating with a hive mind that we can't disrupt or take down. It doesn't matter if you block their comm links. They'll still be able to coordinate the defense of their ship, and that's assuming we can dock. For all we know, the Skjora are playing us, and as soon as our transports show up, 50 swarm carriers Q-jump in and vaporize 1/10 of our ground army in one fell swoop. Captain Granger, you will show some respect. And last, but certainly not least, there's the issue of the communication, even if they are liberated from the swarm. We've recently learned, after a little trial and error, that it is in fact possible for an individual to tap into the swarm communication network, even after they've been liberated. We don't understand it, but we know this as fact.
And how do we know that, Granger? Did you contact your swarm buddies and tell them to meet you at York?
General Norton was back on his feet now, pointing angrily at him. To everyone's surprise, Granger nodded.
As a matter of fact, I did.
Silence.
To clarify, this was not until after they left, after the destruction of York. But when I got there, I summoned them back. And they came. I also, unwittingly, summoned the Dolmasi, and they came too, saving our asses in the process, and giving me vital intel on the Skjora in the process.
Norton turned to President Avery.
Ma'am, it's clear what we're dealing with. I warned you about him time and again. We can't continue on with this security threat in our midst. I mean, for God's sake, he's just admitted to communicating sensitive fleet movements to the swarm.
Avery eyed him suspiciously.
Captain, anything else you'd like to say? I've half a mind to quarantine you for the duration of the war, either until we win or the swarm come in and break you out of prison and carry you home as a conquering hero.
One more thing, Madam President. After the incident at Wellington shipyards, you yourself authorized Commander Proctor to conduct blood tests on all senior-level defense officials and officers. Obviously, she has only scratched the surface, but she's managed to test a number of them. Upwards of 30 captains, admirals, generals, the like. I'm afraid she has some disturbing news.
All eyes turned toward Commander Proctor.
It's preliminary, of course, Avery snorted. Out with it. They've tested positive for one particular form of the swarm virus.
It took Avery a moment to put together what she said.
When you say they, I mean they. All of them. Every captain I test, every admiral. I tested the late Rear Admiral Littlefield's blood, too. Same thing. All of them carry the backdoor virus, and all of them, potentially, could be used against us, like Littlefield.
Chapter 32. The cold, bright lights glared overhead. He tried to focus on them, but fell asleep. Then he was at the window. Just moments earlier he knew he'd been lying down, staring at the light fixture above him, hearing the presence behind him. Someone stood there just out of sight. Now, at the window, he couldn't take his eyes off the planet. The planet. Oh, the planet. It was beautiful. It was a deep green dappled with lakes and clouds, and it called to him. No. Wait. It was not green and full of lakes. It was a deep blue. Bolder than water, but not icy like the swirling clouds of Neptune. This was deeper and warmer and bluer and alive. The presence behind him had returned. It opened the door, then shut it firmly. He didn't turn around. There was no need. The presence would speak eventually. All he cared about was that planet. And beyond the planet. Chapter 33. Captain's Quarters, ISS Warrior. High Orbit, Britannia. Granger awoke with a start. He'd spent over an hour tossing and turning, worrying about Operation Ground War, and when he'd finally fallen asleep, the usual dream returned. What he was sure was the actual memory of being held by the Russians and swarm 4 months ago. His sheets were wet with sweat, but he'd kicked the blanket off and he was shivering. A glance at the clock told him he'd gotten 3 hours, and with a sigh he rolled over and heaved himself to his feet. 3 hours was considered good sleep these days. A cold shower helped wake him up, and he was glad he'd finished quickly, because as he finished dressing, the door chimed.
"Come in,"
he grumbled. The door slid open, and outside he could see the 2 Marines standing guard, flanking Shelby Proctor, who poked her head in.
You dressed?
"Barely. Come in."
He waved her through and pulled up a chair.
Sorry, no time to chit-chat, she said, refusing the chair. I just wanted to let you know. Well, I've got good news and bad news.
"Hit me,"
he said, applying shaving cream to his stubble. In the mirror, under the harsh light of the vanity, his eyes looked bruised, but that was just the deep shadows cast by his fatigue.
The bad news. I'm sorry, Tim, I've tried everything I can think of and ran through test after test with my team, but we just can't seem to block the metaspace signal like the swarm can. I'm sure we'll figure it out, but not yet.
He grumbled. That was bad news, especially in light of her findings yesterday with the blood tests. With most of the Admiralty and ship captains infected with the backdoor virus, he didn't know who he could trust. Zingano was clean, fortunately, but he couldn't very well quarantine every single one of his infected admirals and captains. The fleet would fall apart.
"Please tell me the good news makes up for it."
It might. I had a few team members do some tests, and they've collaborated with their counterparts at IDF Science, and we might have a pharmacological solution. A temporary one, at least.
Pharmacological? You're gonna drug them all?
He ran the razor across his cheeks, revealing clean, wrinkled skin underneath the stubble. Time to do something about those wrinkles, too.
Ah, hell, who am I kidding?
I am. It turns out that one of the many things the backdoor virus does when triggered is increase the levels of oxytocin and serotonin in the brain. Those influence our feelings of love, of friendship, and similar bonding emotions, making it easier for the virus to do the rest of its work, influencing the host to do certain acts. But if we simply block those chemicals, suppress them, then the virus can't work as well as it usually does.
So, basically make us all assholes. Great. You've tested this?
His face was clear, and he moved to his neck, drawing the razor carefully across his Adam's apple.
On a lieutenant at IDF Science that we discovered was infected. I first hit him with a metaspace signal that I suspect mimics a swarm signal, and he showed elevated levels of oxytocin and serotonin. Then, after I injected him with the suppressant and hit him again with the signal, the levels stayed the same.
Will it work?
No way to tell, without an actual swarm signal telling someone infected with the backdoor virus to go do something. At the very least, when the signal comes, the drug may give that person pause, may give them some moments of clarity where they realize what they're doing, and may even delay action long enough for someone else to see them and realize what's going on.
He finished up and wiped his face clean.
Sounds risky, but I guess it's all we've got. Besides,
he sat down and pulled his boots on.
Risk is our calling card.
She followed him to the door when he stood up.
I've distributed the suppressant in pill form to the top brass, and every captain and commander in the fleet participating in Operation Ground War.
Good. As harebrained as that mission is, it won't do us any good to have captains with loose screws. Zingano messaged me. We're to leave in 3 hours. You all ready?
Well, after I spent the night working on the suppressant, I huddled with my science team to work on the quantum field versus relativistic gravitational field theory I mentioned to you earlier, and—
He stopped and grabbed her arm.
Wait, Shelby, are you telling me you didn't sleep last night?
He looked into her face when she turned back to him. She looked exhausted, and almost as old as Granger, even though she was at least 30 years younger.
I dozed in between test essays, she said defensively. Look, Tim, sleep can wait. Don't worry, I've had plenty of coffee and a few energy pills, and then some more coffee. Believe me, I'm fine.
He let go of her arm and grumbled as they continued.
I'm warning you. One more day like this, and I swear I'll order you to bed.
He'd been kidding, of course, but he softened his tone further.
I worry about you, Shelby. I worry you're working yourself too hard.
She smiled back at him.
I'm touched, Tim. Really, I am. Now, go show the same concern to the rest of the crew. They need it.
Before they walked on to the bridge, he gave a lazy salute to her.
Yes, ma'am.
Chapter 34. Bridge, ISS Warrior. Interstellar space, 2.4 light-years from Sirius.
Hold the next Q jump,
said Granger.
Distance?
0.1 light-years, sir,
said Ensign Prince. Doubt nodded him. He was uneasy with the plan put forth by President Avery and General Norton. He supposed he was hesitant because the plan was, put bluntly, utterly cutthroat. Take advantage of a potential friend before they'd even determined the nature of that friend. Use them as a tool against the swarm before understanding them or knowing anything about them. And yet, Avery's logic was sound in a brutal sort of way. The human race was on the brink, and when it came to the basic survival of the race, something to ensure that humans would always be found somewhere in the universe, they could stop at nothing. Nothing to prevent total annihilation, even if betrayal meant giving up their souls in exchange for their lives. But Granger didn't care about his life, and he supposed neither did Avery. They cared about the future, and yet he had to be sure they weren't walking into a trap.
After the final Q jump, take us most of the way in, but stop 10 million kilometers short. We need to see what's going on before we jump all the way in.
Aye, aye, sir.
Moments later, the star field on the view screen shifted again.
Full scan, Mr. Diamond. Optical, EM bands.
Ensign Diamond nodded.
At 10 million kilometers, the light is about 30 seconds old, sir.
Understood, Ensign.
The sensor crew performed the scans.
Picking up the super dreadnought, sir. Right at the rendezvous point.
Is it alone?
Yes, sir.
Granger stroked his chin, finally smooth after that much-needed shave. His body was protesting the ungodly schedule, but there would always be time to sleep on the beach when this was all over. Or when he was dead, which, if he was being honest, was a more likely scenario.
Extend scan to all directions. Anything?
The sensor crew busied themselves, and a minute later Diamond shook his head.
Nothing, sir. We're in the middle of interstellar space, nothing around for light years. Or at least light minutes that we can tell.
Of course,
said Granger.
There could be a swarm fleet waiting just a light day away. They could have been waiting there for half a day and we'd never know it.
Yes, sir,
agreed Diamond. Granger paced a few times across the bridge before deciding.
Very well. Take us the rest of the way in. They've probably detected us by now. This was probably good for them, too. Let them see from a distance that we're coming alone. Even though a 500,000-strong army is right behind us.
Cue jump in 5,
said Ensign Prince. Granger glanced back at the XO station and caught Lieutenant Diaz's eye. The Deputy XO nodded back, indicating his readiness. Proctor was holed up in her lab, continuing her cowboy research, as she called it, right up until the last minute before battle operations were scheduled to begin. Granger was supposed to keep the Sciorra talking for at least an hour. The screen shifted one final time, revealing the immense mass and mind-boggling length of the super dreadnought. It stretched off into the distance, its hull mostly dark and invisible due to the lack of sunlight, except where it was punctuated by thousands of lit viewports.
I just can't get used to how massive that thing is,
said Diaz. Granger paused his pacing in the middle of the bridge.
And that there's 6 of them.
He turned to Tactical.
Begin scans. Go through the checklist provided by Colonel Barnard of things to confirm. Ship layout, atmospheric conditions, numbers of life signs, automation systems, all of it. I'll buy you as much time as possible.
We're being hailed, sir,
said Ensign Prucha.
Patch it through.
The familiar form of Vice Imperator Scythia Krull filled the screen. One of her deputies stood nearby, another Sciorra woman who eyed Granger carefully.
Captain Granger, you've come. We were undecided of whether you would arrive or not.
Of course I've come. We owe you a great debt. To not come would have been disrespectful to you. And you have no idea how much we're about to disrespect you.
Thank you, Captain Granger. I have summoned my peoples. I believe a close translation to your language would be Bonded Council of 7, our leaders and matriarchs. They come for a council of war, a war to finally liberate all of the family from its master.
Granger raised an eyebrow.
You have your own Concord out of 7?
The swarm appropriated the social structure from us, almost 10,000 years ago. They don't have original ideas, Captain. That is their failing. I've debated with my sisters as to whether they are truly alive or not. Living beings must create to survive. The swarm does not create. It appropriates. It infests and corrupts and controls. And so when the swarm came to our world, they took what they thought would serve them, and destroyed the rest.
And yet, here you are,
said Granger. He weighed the benefits of putting up a skeptical front this early in the conversation, but he supposed if he had entered into dialogue under the pretenses the Sciorra assumed, he'd most likely sound doubtful at first. Either way, Vice Imperator Krull took it in stride.
Over the millennia, the swarm permitted us to retain those parts of our culture they found useful. And now finally we have discovered the key to thwarting their control over us.
Granger was becoming more skeptical by the second. How could a species, after millennia of control by the swarm, suddenly figure out a way to break free, when the swarm's control extends so completely over every individual they dominate? How does one suddenly just spontaneously cast off complete control? Though he remembered that Dulmasi had already proven it was possible.
And how is that? How was it that you suddenly found yourselves free of swarm influence? To be honest, it seems suspect.
The Vice Imperator's face sagged a little. Granger couldn't even guess what the expression meant.
Captain Granger, we are here, all of us, all of my people, because of you. What you see here, this ship, and 5 others like it, contain all that remains of the once proud race of the Skjora, and we are here, and free, because of you.
Chapter 35. Russian Singularity Production Facility. High Orbit. Penumbra 3.
"Welcome to Penumbra Station, Eamon," said Ambassador Volodin at the exit of the docking hatch.
The crew had been instructed to remain with the ship. Only Isaacson's Secret Service escort was allowed to accompany him, though Isaacson had half a mind to dismiss them too, given their inability to protect him during the bombing attempt on his life 2 months ago, and the fighter attack immediately after. The swarm had penetrated deep into the bureaucracy. He couldn't even trust his security folks.
Yuri, this is incredible. Is this the rock that was caved out by... you know?
"It is. Actual construction took far longer, of course, but the excavation only took a few months."
He started walking down the hallway.
"Come, President Malakoff awaits."
Volodin took them deep into the complex, passing first by a series of bays holding equipment, large containers, and storage boxes which merged gradually into a section of the station devoted to experimental work, with gleaming high-tech labs, high-energy power sources and gas chambers, and then through what appeared to be the administrative area. The desks and cubicles gave way to a large expanse filled with what looked like natural light reflected in from Penumbra's sun. The space in the middle stretched up at least 15 levels, each floor bordered by a railing that wrapped around the free expanse in the middle. It wasn't crowded, but the occasional worker glanced their way, sometimes recognizing Isaacson with wide eyes, but no one stopped to say anything. Instead, Volodin led them to an elevator shaft near the central railing on their deck. Its walls were clear, and Isaacson felt a moment of vertigo as they shot up through the empty space. At the very top, at least 100 meters above the ground floor, they arrived at the executive offices. Lush carpeting covered parts of the floor of the atrium, and the fine surfaces of marble, granite, and crystal glittered everywhere. There was even a giant fish tank with coral and exotic, colorful fish that could be seen in another reception area nearby. The walls were lined with giant pictures of President Malakoff in various manly situations. One showed him at the top of Everest, shirtless, no oxygen tank in sight, looking through binoculars at some unseen sight off in the distance. Another was of him doing what looked like a pull-up, dangling 2 kilometers from the famous Whittingham Suspension Bridge connecting 2 towers in Britannia's capital city. Frame after frame boasted of his physical and testosterone-filled exploits, occasionally softened by a random image of him caressing a poor, wrinkled grandmother's face, or of the president sitting on a tree trunk in a picturesque setting, with children on his lap and surrounding him, fawning over him playfully, yet worshipfully. They reminded Isaacson of the old kitschy Christian paintings of Jesus, showing him in similar settings, all unbiblical but inspiring to the simple people that needed such unrefined and simple-minded inspiration in their lives. Oh, the poor masses, taken in by such tripe and propaganda. And yet Isaacson couldn't help but admire it. Crude, but brilliant, he thought. If I ever knock Avery off, I should keep something like this in mind. He automatically cringed, expecting the usual shock that accompanied the treasonous thoughts whenever they slipped through his guard, and sure enough his head felt like it contracted and twisted in pain. It only lasted a moment, but enough to make him sway and nearly lose his footing. Surely Avery couldn't monitor him from this far away, could she? Had the reaction simply become automatic on his part?
"Eamon, are you all right?"
Isaacson waved him off. Fine, just dizzy from the ride up. A door opened nearby. Isaacson expected to see a security contingent come in and escort him to the Russian president. But instead, just a single man walked through, dressed in a simple business suit with an old-fashioned red power tie, clicking along the marble floor in sensible but fashionable black shoes at a confident pace, gazing straight ahead toward Isaacson, his hand extended for a greeting. President Malikov. Chapter 36. Bridge, ISS Warrior. Interstellar space, 2.4 light-years from Sirius.
Because of me.
The words began to dawn on him, the gravity of their meaning finally weighing on him.
Are you telling me that your ship is full of your entire society? Families? Children? This ship and the other 5 contain your entire civilization?
That is correct, Captain.
Which meant he, Granger, was guilty of a genocide. Or at least 1/7 of a genocide.
And the ship I destroyed? Over in Dira?
The Harmony held the once great house of the Trell, 5th family of the bonded Council of 7. Vice Imperator Terry Trell, my 3rd cousin, was their matriarch.
Granger stumbled to his seat.
How many?
Excuse me, Captain.
How many of your people were on that ship? The Harmony?
It doesn't matter, Captain Granger. All that matters is that we make plans—
Granger waved a hand dismissively.
It matters to me. How many?
Vice Imperator Krull hesitated.
Approximately 50 billion.
The words pierced him to the core. He felt hollow and distant, like he was observing the situation from above his head.
But how is that possible? Our scans of your vessel reveal only around 200,000 life readings. Does your ship carry similar numbers?
As the Harmony? No, not by far. We only number 14 billion here in the House Krull on the Benevolence. The life readings you see are accurate, Granger, but most of us are mothers, and our children are already born, inside us, waiting for us to give them the exterior life. I still hold over 22,000 of my children within me.
22,000?
Breathed Granger incredulously.
How is that possible?
They are embryos, of course, and mostly composed of brain tissue, but even though they lack the rest of their bodies, each is a fully developed individual, a person.
And they will all be born later? To the exterior life?
Some will. Most won't. Most will live the interior life for their whole existence, and they are linked to me. They are part of me. I hear their thoughts, their passions, their fears, and their hopes. Each of them has memory, and some are suited to remembering certain things, certain concepts. The majority of mine are suited to remembering communication, diplomacy, and relationships, and so I was chosen as Vice Imperator of my house at the moment of liberation.
When was that? When were you liberated?
You don't know.
Her face stretched. Surprise.
This happened 2 days ago, during the battle over your world. Indira, you called it. One moment we were thralls of the Valerisi, then you came. You destroyed the Harmony, coming with such speed and destruction that it was ripped into pieces. Some of those pieces broke off and collided with singularities. Those were the first to be liberated, and from them it spread. And through our metaspace link, a good translation might be the ligature, the effect spread to us all. Something about what you did saved us all, in spite of the unthinkable destruction.
Finally, Granger understood. The singularities, the swarm matter. When those doomed Skjora fell into the singularities, they emerged cleansed from the virus. Somewhere. Just like Granger. And through the metaspace link, the effect spread to their whole race. Yet the Vice Imperator seemed to have no idea of how it actually happened. Which was good. The fewer people who knew about the effect, the better. If they could keep the swarm in the dark about their knowledge, it would give them more of a tactical advantage. But he was still wary. Was this a trick? The swarm could be feeding her what to say, drawing him in, gaining his trust, waiting for him to lower his guard. Except, why? The super dreadnought, the Benevolence, outpowered and outgunned the Warrior over 1,000 to 1. If the swarm wanted a shot at Granger, they didn't need subterfuge to get it. Just a scant minute in battle with that monstrosity of a ship would be enough to finish him off. Unless, he paused, weighing the possibilities, the swarm wanted something else. Chapter 37. Bridge, ISS Lincoln. Interstellar space, 2.5 light-years from Sirius. General Norton, we're at 1 hour, sir. The general paced the bridge of the ISS Lincoln, circling the captain's chair, where the ship's commander waited for the order that would take them into battle.
And no word from Granger?
None, the comm officer replied. No metaspace transmissions, nothing except the constant background noise of swarm communications, right at the frequencies and phase patterns you gave to us, sir. Norton chuckled. Ah, Commander Proctor. At least you're good for something besides being Granger's lapdog. He turned back to the science station where Commander Alonso, IDF's Associate Chief Scientist and Director for Intra-Swarm Communications, stood monitoring the progress of his science crew.
Commander, any progress in actually breaking down what they're saying out there?
No, sir, but we've definitely built off of Commander Proctor's work. She was never able to achieve such tight phase discrimination as we have.
Overconfidence, Commander Alonso. Overconfidence, arrogance, and hubris. They're Granger's call sign, and it's rubbed off on his XO. If she would simply collaborate with IDF science more instead of striking out on her own, trying to be the hero, thinking herself special and above the rules, we may have won this war months ago. But she's just like the bricklayer, just like Granger.
Commander Alonso shrugged. She has given us perfectly good data. A little rough, some of her conclusions are a little hasty, but really, she's done adequate work.
And yet, if she had have collaborated with you, she'd be scanning for the backdoor virus frequency on the proper phase configuration. But it's obvious why she's not doing that. I don't believe it's that she can't, Commander. It's that she won't. She knows that if she lets that knowledge out, it'll compromise Granger's ability to work, because I'll catch him in the act, talking with the swarm, collaborating, just like he's doing now.
The science chief shuffled uncomfortably. Well, sir, that is one interpretation of the data we're seeing. Norton turned to face him threateningly.
What other valid interpretation is there? Granger is there, with the swarm dreadnought, talking to them, virus to virus, mind to mind, sharing our secrets. We clearly see the metaspace signals. What the hell are they doing if not that?
Silence. Commander Alonso had no answer.
Exactly.
Norton turned to watch the view screen. The camera was panned wide, out toward their fleet. Thousands of troop carriers, hundreds of thousands of Marines, and half of Zingano's fleet, just in case. And one other thing, floating just beyond the fleet. None of the vessels were lit, except for a few visible viewports that cast pale, weak light on the hull around them. But even without the light, enough stars were blocked out to make it obvious that this was the largest fleet of ships IDF had ever assembled.
Give them 10 more minutes. If we don't hear from Granger by then, we're going in. Relay the orders to Zingano and Colonel Barnard.
Commander Alonso made one last attempt. But, General, if what you say is true, if you think Granger is being played by the swarm, or even colluding with them, then he already knows our battle plans, our secret. Wouldn't it be wiser to pull back, regroup, and think this through?
Norton snorted a harsh, short laugh. Well, it's a good thing I didn't tell Granger all my secrets. He glowered at the scientist. Stick to numbers and data, Commander. Leave the tactics to me.
Chapter 38. Bridge, ISS Warrior. Interstellar space, 2.4 light-years from Sirius. Granger glanced at the countdown timer. He'd promised General Norton and Admiral Zingano he'd keep the Sciorra talking for at least an hour. Enough time for Warrior to take more detailed scans of the dreadnought, compare the readings to the originals and the projections from Norton's tactical modeling crew, and pass any corrections on to the invasion force when it finally arrived. 39 minutes. And now Granger wasn't even sure he wanted the invasion force to show up. The entire Sciorra civilization was on those 6 remaining ships. Could he participate in a genocide of a people that was itself in thrall to the swarm? Even if it meant deliverance of his own. Too many questions.
Excuse me for one moment, Vice Imperator.
He signaled to Ensign Prucha to mute and thumbed the comm open to Proctor in her lab.
You been listening in, Shelby?
I have, in between essays. Very interesting. Do you believe them?
Don't know. I think you'd better get up here. I want some metaspace scans of the vicinity around their ship.
I've been scanning. Absolutely silent as far as I can tell. I'm no metaspace expert, of course, but...
Granger glanced at the muted image of the Skiora matriarch on the screen.
I'd still like you up here.
On my way.
The comm cut out, and Granger motioned to Prucha and turned back to Krull.
Vice Imperator, I hope you can appreciate the difficult position I'm in. On the one hand, I recognize the dire need we all have to trust each other and work together to defeat the swarm, the Valarissi. And yet, you must realize that I need evidence that you are not under swarm control. It would be foolish to put our fate in your hands by taking you at your word so blindly. Normally, a relationship like this would require time, but time is running out.
Krull held up both palms, revealing 3 long, delicate fingers and 1 beefier thumb on each hand.
The same is true for us, Granger. The Valarissi guard knowledge of the other friends very jealously. We know little of the Dolmasi, for example, only that you've been in contact with them. We were there when they became friends and entered the Concordat of 7, but have not seen them for thousands of years. Similarly, we know little of the Adanasi, the part of your race that has been made friends. We have no idea who among your crew are communicating with the Valarissi, or even if you, Granger, are one with them. Through the ligature, I sense that you were once a friend at least. But now...
I assure you I'm not. But I propose a test, Vice Imperator. We have the ability to detect the presence of swarm matter in the blood. I assume you have blood.
Of course.
At that moment, Proctor walked through the doors. Granger waved her over.
My associate here has developed a test that will reveal whether one is under swarm control or not. Will you submit to the test? I think just your blood will suffice. At the same time, you can watch us test my blood, or if you prefer, we can pass along the method, and your scientists can try it themselves.
Proctor's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. It was a huge gamble to tell the Skiora that they had figured out how to detect swarm influence. If the swarm were playing them, they were giving up one of the few intel advantages they had.
We accept, said Vice Imperator Krull, and seeing the results from your lab will be sufficient, if you'll permit me to verify them. I will board a shuttle immediately. Shall we meet shuttle to shuttle, or shall I come aboard your ship?
Granger had no idea what she meant by verify, but he nodded his agreement.
Meet me in our shuttle bay as soon as possible. My superiors have given me a deadline that I must adhere to, or there may be unpleasant consequences. We'll relay coordinates momentarily.
He inclined his head towards Ensign Prucha, who began entering in the shuttle bay coordinates into the comm to send to the Skiora. The screen flickered off. Proctor raised her eyebrow.
Risky?
I know.
But I think they're telling the truth.
Me too.
He motioned toward the doors.
Let's go.
He glanced over at the Deputy XO.
Have Sergeant Washington set up in the shuttle bay, guards at the doors and at least 20 more in the hallway beyond, and sharpshooters. But tell him to keep it discreet.
Aye, aye, sir, said Diaz. As they walked out the doors, he called back to the tactical station.
Time, Mr. Diamond.
45 minutes, sir.
Damn, he mumbled. We're cutting this a little too close.
Chapter 39. Shuttle Bay, ISS Warrior. Interstellar space, 2.4 light-years from Sirius. They raced to the shuttle bay, making a quick detour to Proctor's lab to pick up a few sample vials and a blood-draw meta-syringe. When they arrived, the Skiora shuttle was already passing through the force field holding the air in. Granger noticed 3 men, including Sergeant Washington, perched up on the second-level walkways spanning the perimeter of the room. No weapons were visible, but if they were doing their job, they could get set up for a shot within 2 seconds. The shuttle landed. It was almost like a miniature version of a swarm carrier. And as the ramp descended, Vice Imperator Krull didn't even wait for it to lock into place as she quickly descended. She was short, no more than 5 feet, but walked almost disconcertingly fast for such a small person. The view screen hadn't done her justice. Though lithe and thin, a powerful muscle structure flexed noticeably behind her taut, faintly blue-beige skin. He began to wonder if perhaps Vishkane Karsa was right. These people didn't sound like vicious warriors, and they didn't look it. But watching Krull's gait and the way she carried herself, he started to suspect that she could be deadly in a close-quarters fight.
Granger.
She outstretched her 2 hands out above her shoulders and to the side, palms toward the 2 walls. A greeting. He mirrored the motion back to her. She responded with an unexpected laugh. How interesting. Facial expressions, gestures, these all varied. But the laugh seemed to be universal. At least for humans, Dulmasi and Skjora.
You honor me by returning my greeting after what you suppose is our custom. But among us, the male reaches forward, not to the side.
My apologies,
said Granger, bringing his arms forward toward her.
No need to apologize. No need even to honor our customs. If I knew yours, I would participate.
A simple handshake is customary,
he said before pausing, thinking better of it. He remembered what happened the last time he'd shaken hands with an alien he'd just met. Vishkane Karsa had implanted the false memory of seeing the swarm homeworld, leading to near disaster. Her hands, still extended to the side, started to quiver. Realizing what she was doing, shaking her hands, he grunted a laugh as well.
No, I mean we clasp each other's hands, but that can wait until we know each other better.
I understand.
She lowered her arms. He waved Proctor forward.
My second-in-command, Shelby Proctor.
They nodded at each other.
I and all my children greet you both, and thank you. Your children, began Proctor. You say they are alive, already individuals. Are they self-aware, conscious? Of course, Krull replied. I know them all, individually. If they ever attain the exterior life, their knowledge and personalities will develop further as they grow. But they are intelligent. I wouldn't be a fraction of what I am now without them. Most of them will never see the light of the exterior life, but the interior life is a full and beautiful one.
You rely on them? Asked Proctor.
Yes. I store memories in them. I confer with them. They help me reason and make judgments and work out problems, even under Valerisi control. In a sense, being under their control was almost second nature, as it was just one more voice in my mind, albeit an all-powerful, overriding voice that I could not disobey. And now, for the first time in millennia, my thoughts are free of them, just me and my children in here now, she said, touching her head. If you'll excuse the question, Vice Imperator, exactly how old are you? Measured in the time cycle of our home ships, 1007. 750 of your years. I am one of the oldest. My children are on every ship. Thousands of them. I've mated with tens of thousands.
Granger and Proctor exchanged significant, uncomfortable glances, but it was fascinating. He had no idea that a species could be so vastly different from themselves, though he supposed it shouldn't come as a surprise, given the extreme biodiversity even on Earth. He wanted to interview her for hours, days. Her people and her culture were beginning to be beautiful to him. But time was running out.
Vice Imperator, if you'll permit Commander Proctor to extract a sample,
he said, indicating the meta-syringe Proctor held. Krull held out a long arm, the muscles rippling subtly beneath the skin. No sagging, no wrinkles. Granger wondered just how old an individual Skjora could get, or how age manifested itself in one of their bodies. So many questions, so much to learn, and so little time. The sample vial filled quickly with blood, which, surprisingly to Granger, came out just as red as his. For some reason he was expecting it to be blue or green or some other alien color. Red, just like him. Even Skjora blood flowed red. Proctor nodded.
All done. I can get this analyzed in minutes.
She pulled out a datapad, brought up a display, and handed it to Krull.
Here are the results of Granger's tests. I'm sure the two of you can discuss them further, now if you'll both excuse me.
She raced out of the shuttle bay toward her lab. Granger turned back to Krull.
As you can see, the virus is still present in my blood, but it has been effectively deactivated. I can still use it to... how did you put it? Use the ligature? But otherwise it has no sway over me.
Krull examined the data displayed on the chart. She appeared to have a decent grasp of English, but he wondered how much of the written language she understood.
I see,
she said.
You mentioned something about verification.
Yes. Through the ligature. I can do it mind to mind, but physical contact is more precise. All I need is your hand.
He was worried about this. She wanted to do exactly what Karsa had done, get in his head, sift around. Could she alter memories, too? Could she control him? He hesitated. She seemed to sense his uneasiness.
You have nothing to fear. I cannot control you. I cannot even control my own children. Even the very youngest, at just 90 cycles, has such a ferocious will of his own that I cannot even say good morning to him without getting an earful. So I'm sure an old man like you is in no danger of influence from me.
The youngest is 90?
He decided not to tell her he was 65 and had nearly died 4 months ago.
Is touch necessary?
No. I can communicate with all my exterior children through the ligature, the one and only good thing that has come from our subservience to the Valerisi. And I can communicate with you as well, through the ligature. But the interior children, since they are in physical contact with me, I have immediate access to whatever they want to show me, and while in that communion, one can see through deception. Such it is with the Valerisi. There is no lying to them. So it is with my children. If they attempt to deceive, I know it.
She laughed. Somehow, despite her alien appearance, the laugh was endearing.
A mother always knows. And while we commune, in essence, you will be my child. You cannot lie to me, and I will be yours. I cannot lie to you.
There was no other way. At least no other timely way. He was sure the hour had elapsed already. Norton and the invasion force would be here soon. With a start, he extended his hand to her. She reached out to his, and they clasped each other. He felt her, there inside of him. Not as an intrusive presence, but almost as a neighbor, standing patiently on the front porch of his mind. At first he didn't know what to do, but as she was just standing there, waiting, expectantly, making no effort to in any way push herself into his thoughts, he projected his own thoughts out at her. With some effort he brought up the image of Proctor extracting a sample of blood from his arm. She collected the vial and inserted it into the imaging scope in her lab. He wasn't there for the actual analysis, and had no mental imagery to project to Krull of that process, but he remembered Proctor summoning him back and showing him the results. The virus, broken down and inactivated. He projected his relief that he felt as Proctor explained that the swarm had no influence over him, that whatever had happened to the virus had made it completely benign, harmless but still useful. With another jerk he stopped. The explanation of why the virus was inactive had started to come to his remembrance, and so he shut it down. There was still no reason he needed to let that slip, that traversing a quantum singularity somehow had the effect of neutralizing swarm virus. He let her hand drop.
I understand,
she said slowly. He wasn't sure if she had noticed his unwillingness to share everything.
You speak the truth. You truly fight the Valerisi, and your blood is cleansed of them. But there is some knowledge you deliberately withhold from me.
She looked down at her feet as if considering her words.
No matter. I feel your intent. It is not to harm. It is to save.
She held her arms out to the side as she did in greeting.
I trust you, Captain Granger.
He mirrored the motion before remembering what she had said earlier and brought his arms forward as was customary for the males in her race. She laughed again.
No, you had it right the first time. Arms forward in greeting in a male, arms to the side for expressions of...
Friendship?
He asked as she trailed off.
Family,
she said.
With the Valerisi we were friends, or at least their corrupted version of that. But with you, you are family.
She paused and closed her eyes momentarily.
I have communicated this to the other matriarchs and vice-imperators of the Bonded Council of Seven. It is agreed. We will wage war alongside you, for freedom and for family.
Granger smiled. It was time to send a metaspace signal out to the fleet, with much better news than he'd hoped. Proctor's voice cut through the silence in the shuttle bay.
Captain, just finished the analysis. She's clean. Has a similar inactive virus that you do. Slightly different, that's to be expected since the Skura biology is not the same as ours, but it's clearly inactive.
Any idea why it's different?
Probably a species difference. I mean, she is Skura and you're human. I'd expect difference in the way the swarm virus interacts with—
Her voice cut out abruptly, replaced by Lieutenant Diaz's.
Captain, the fleet has arrived with no warning, and they've started firing on the dreadnought.
Chapter 40. Executive Command Center, Russian Singularity Production Facility. High Orbit, Penumbra 3.
Mr. Vice President, it is good to finally meet you, said President Malikov.
Isaacson noticed that his handshake was frighteningly firm, though not painfully so. After seeing all the propaganda, news vids, and listening in on all the intelligence reports from IDF intel on the Russian strongman, it was almost surreal to see him there in person, as a real flesh-and-blood individual. Someone real, and not a rumor, a caricature, or a terror, as popular culture in the West tended to depict the man. His accent was obvious, but not too thick. He clearly had a good command of English.
Mr. Malikov, the feeling is mutual. President Avery sends her regards.
He chose his words carefully.
I'm sure.
Malikov turned to Volodin.
That will be all, Yuri.
Isaacson felt Volodin stiffen next to him. He clearly hadn't expected to be dismissed. That was not part of the plan. They discussed the possibilities for how the meeting could play out. Isaacson wasn't quite sure how they'd get the president into a vulnerable enough position to take him out, and they'd rehearsed various scenarios together. Being alone with the president was not one of them.
But, Mr. President, I thought we were going to discuss—
Malikov waved him off.
Later.
He pointed to the elevator. Go. Now. Uneasily, Volodin edged toward the door, glancing tentatively at Isaacson, who wanted to protest, to say something to keep the ambassador there.
Mr. Isaacson, you'll notice I have no security here with me. I have no need of it. Neither do you. Your men will wait downstairs with Mr. Volodin.
Red flags were going off in Isaacson's mind. The Secret Service chief protested.
Sir, we're not going to leave you here alone with Mr. Malikov.
Malikov turned toward Isaacson. The expression on his face was clear. Are you a man or not? The look on his face, his stance, his upturned eyebrow, they all said the same thing, daring him to dismiss the guards, questioning his resolve, his manhood. Damn it, Isaacson wasn't going to stand for that.
No, I'll be fine. I'm perfectly safe here. Wait downstairs.
But go,
shouted Isaacson, pointing toward the elevator door where Volodin waited. He was not going to be second-guessed, have his authority questioned in front of the Russian president, who seemed more than in control of his own situation. He could be in control too, damn it. The Secret Service guards reluctantly filed into the elevator, and a few seconds later, he was alone with President Malikov, who, to Isaacson's surprise, burst out into a boisterous laugh.
Ha! Did you see the looks on their faces? Sycophants, pretenders and attention-seekers, all of them, including good old Yuri. Come on, Mr. Isaacson, let's go discuss matters in my observatory.
He started walking toward the door he'd come out of, though Isaacson stayed put, confused. Malikov paused and looked back.
You don't trust me, do you, Mr. Isaacson?
I don't know you, Mr. Malikov. Plus, we're at war. How can I possibly trust—
Because, Eamon— can I call you Eamon? Because my estimable opponent, even though we are at war, I do acknowledge that, we are actually on the same side, though you might not realize it.
Oh? Isaacson raised an eyebrow and crossed his arms.
How so?
Malikov paced back to him and put an arm around his shoulders, guiding him toward the door. Because we are both human, and both fight to survive. Individually, nationally, and more importantly, as a race, a civilization. You fight the swarm. I use the swarm, Eamon. I am not to be controlled or taken advantage of by some race of vile, raw sewage. I shit more intelligent sludge than the swarm. I've played for fools many people in my career, Eamon. The United Earth Senate, President Avery, her predecessor, all the governors of all the United Earth worlds and the worlds of the Confederation. But the ones I've played the worst are the swarm. My finest accomplishment, the pinnacle of my career. Isaacson rolled his eyes even as he allowed himself to be led through the door into a large room that looked more like a science laboratory than an office, or what had Malikov called it? An observatory? Please, Mr. Malikov, you're not claiming to have been on our side all along, are you? Just pretending to be allied with the swarm so you can stab them in the back when the stakes are at their highest? I'm a little smarter than that. Your side? You and Avery and the United Earth Government and Senate? No, I'm not on that side. But I am on humanity's side. I am humanity's best friend. Isaacson stopped mid-stride. I've heard that language before. The swarm wants to make friends of us all. You're one of them, aren't you? You've been infected. I'm talking to the swarm right now. Malikov laughed. And laughed. Eamon, my man, I am one of the few people you've talked to in the last few days that is not infected by the swarm. Isaacson's jaw hung open. Yuri? Swarm, confirmed Malikov. My Secret Service detail. Swarm, though in their case they've been infected with the backdoor version. He pointed up to an electronic device on the ceiling and another one above the doorframe. Metaspace detection grid. No swarm communication happens anywhere on this station without my knowing about it. I read your security details' swarm control the moment they stepped on the station. Not day-to-day control, but should it be necessary, the back door can be potent, as you no doubt discovered with the incident at Wellington Station. The implications ran through Isaacson's mind as he connected the dots. So, the assassination attempt, in Moscow, with the car, obviously set up by your own men. Not consciously, of course, but it's true. And the incident with the 2 fighters over North America on your return trip the next day, also due to your men. Same with Avery's detail, though at least she had the sense to turn most of her security over to the military, and not all of the Secret Service is compromised, but enough. Believe me, the swarm wants nothing more than to decapitate both governments. Isaacson squinted suspiciously at the other man. How do you know all this? How can I believe you? The main reason is because it makes sense, and you trust your gut, said Malikov as he strode confidently over to a table with a large opaque enclosure resting on top. You're a politician, Eamon. A good one, and very bright. You have a good sense for these kinds of things, and you know I'm telling the truth. The enclosure had a few electronic controls on it, and Malikov pressed a few of the buttons, presenting his finger for an identity scan. But another reason is this. One half of the enclosure turned transparent, almost as clear as glass. Resting underneath it was a naked man. He looked to be awake, but his stare was constant and glassy, as if he were in a daze. Metal rods and electrodes stuck out of his head, and out of his half-open mouth trailed an oxygen tube. Who is he? Malikov saluted toward the prone man behind the enclosure, to Isaacson's surprise. He's a patriot. Warrant Officer Igor Pavlenko. He gave his life to the motherland, though. Malikov glanced up at Isaacson with a grave look on his face. He did not know it at the time. Thought he was volunteering for a special mission. He wasn't aware that mission would be to lie here for 10 years. Isaacson, seeing the forest of electrodes, tubes, and rods protruding from the skull, started to understand, putting the pieces together. This is his mission. He wasn't sure whether to feel horror or awe. He supposed he felt both. He's your swarm experiment. See how the swarm matter affects the body.
You learned how to control it from him.
Malikov shook his head. No, not quite. By the time he volunteered for this mission, I already knew roughly how the swarm communicated and controlled. No, Warrant Officer Pavlenko's mission was not to be an experiment, but to be a back door into the swarm itself. He is fully infected, fully under swarm control, but I've had him heavily sedated and tied in electronically directly to his brainstem, the temporal lobe and the hippocampus. Through those areas, I not only have him immobilized and disabled, but I can decode what he hears through his swarm link, and how his brain interprets those signals. You're spying on the swarm. Why do they let you do this? Isaacson was completely befuddled. He knew that Malikov was either playing him, but why? Or feeding him false information that he would take back to Avery, or maybe, just maybe, he was telling the truth. A politician, and one at war no less, giving the truth to his enemy? I can see the doubt in your eyes, Mr. Isaacson. You don't trust me, and I understand that. What I tell you is true, and I'll tell you why it is true. I make no secret of my aspiration for my culture, my people. I tell you this freely. I do not wish the West to fall, but I want to come out of this war on top, and the West humbled and willing to finally accept friendship with my people, not as superiors, but as equals. And so I tell you the truth because, though lies can be potent tools, the truth is the most powerful weapon of all. Isaacson stood up straight from having stooped to peer at the glassy-eyed Russian soldier. And, Mr. President, what is the truth? Why have you brought me here today? Mr. Vice President, my aim is not to control the swarm, not to use them to cow and intimidate the West. My goal, for my entire career, has been to destroy them, once and for all.